On the 2-year anniversary since the start of the war in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky says 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed after Russia's invasion. According to BBC News, some experts estimate the number to be even higher. Also on the 2-year anniversary of the war, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg expressed the organization's continued support for Ukraine and said the country was closer than ever to NATO.
President Putin started this war because he wanted to close NATO's door and deny Ukraine the right to choose its own path. But he has achieved the exact opposite. Ukraine is now closer to NATO than ever before. We are helping to make our forces more and more interoperable with allies. We will open a new joint analysis, training and education center in Poland together. And we are deepening our political ties through the NATO-Ukraine Council, where we consult and make decisions together. Ukraine will join NATO. It is not a question of if, but of when.
This comes as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland seemed to admit the quiet part out loud when it comes to United States investment in Ukraine.
By the way, we have to remember that the bulk of this money is going right back into the U.S. economy to make those weapons.
Meanwhile, Congresswoman Nancy Mace said the White House has yet to define its mission in Ukraine and told Fox News yesterday that, quote, the one thing that you did not hear Jake Sullivan or Joe Biden say today or really ever is defining our mission in Ukraine. They have yet to define that mission. If we had the answer, we'd be talking about it, and perhaps there'd be more support for it. But let's go to that Victoria Nuland statement, which I think shows you just how wrong the whole approach is. They're like, oh, we're doing like it's good to be sending more money to Ukraine because we build the weapons here. Look, that's just a transfer from the broader economy, from the taxpayers to a specific industry. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is good when you do that for the people in that industry. That doesn't mean it's good for the economy as a whole to just like take money from one person and give them to the other. You haven't like generated economic activity by doing that, because the people from whom the money you took in the first place would have used that to, you know, buy groceries or maybe invest or build a new building. Like, they're going to use it for economic activity. So just because you force people to give money to another group doesn't help the economy overall. It certainly helps the defense industry, which is what we worry about in this whole thing, that so much of our foreign policy is guided by and influenced by people who specifically benefit from the kind of interventionist foreign policy that so many of us worry is actually damaging to our national security.
Yeah, there's something very perverse about being politically opposed to any kind of redistributional politics that's supposed to target the poor, or to say fund infrastructure projects that broadly benefit all Americans, but to say it's good when we spend billions of dollars if some of it trickles down to the defense industry. This is exactly the kind of cyclical involvement of the military-industrial complex that we were so prophetically warned about 60, 70 years ago. What's also pretty striking about this series of clips is the fact that Jens Stoltenberg, just at the end of last year, admitted that the narrative that so many people on the left and more broadly in the anti-interventionist space have been articulating as to the cause of Russia's invasion, not the justification of it, but simply articulating the cause of it, that being this threat of NATO expansion, that was a betrayal of promises that had been made to Russia. He admitted that that, in fact, was the narrative. That is, that he agrees that is the narrative, despite the fact that so many of us have been accused of being Putin puppets, Russian acolytes, for simply articulating that as the truth, and that there was an opportunity to prevent the invasion from happening in the first place by assuring Putin that, in fact, Ukraine would not join NATO. Now we hear him
or outright admitting them and then daring Russia to do something about it, keeping them in this dangling middle ground where they could be invaded and Russia felt aggressed again, was the stupidest of all worlds.
Right. So now to stand at the podium and in a kind of, you know, thumbing your nose kind of a gesture and say, well, we're going to let them in anyway, or they're closer to NATO. Ukraine as a country is closer to NATO than they ever have been. It's difficult to understand what political purpose that kind of rhetoric serves, especially when, again, you have U.S. representatives, you have members of Congress and the State Department, et cetera, saying things like, we should not only be okay with this war because money is trickling down to domestic weapons manufacturers, but that we should also be happy with this war because it's an efficient way to weaken Putin without American bodies being on the line. It really is an out loud way of saying how little one cares about the value of the Ukrainian lives that are very much on the line. That number at least 31,000, and that's not counting the civilian deaths.
Yeah, and there's no way for them to win. I wish I wish they valued the lives of the Ukrainian soldiers as well, absolutely, and I wish they also, our policymakers, valued the American taxpayers' contribution to this. No one likes to see money just set on fire or used for weapons that blow things up that then have to be rebuilt. It's the most destructive use of funding it's for destruction. Yeah. And they would say, no, that's good for the economy. It's totally wrong-headed. Look, at the same time, I understand that at this point, after having been invaded and attacked by Russia, most of Ukraine in the western part of the country does feel more anti-Russian and more a closer proximity to the West and to NATO. And maybe now, because of this reality we've gotten to, you can have some kind of peace deal where Russia keeps the territory it acquired that was disputed and was Russian-leaning and wanted to be part of Russia or wanted to be not part of Ukraine. And then the rest of the country has a justification, an agreement with Russia that it's not going to get invaded again, either because it has that agreement in place or because it does join NATO. Fine, that's what we have to get to as an agreement, but it has to proceed from the understanding that Ukraine is not going to end up reconquering the territory that Russia took. That's just not realistic, and there's no way for it to happen.
Well, John Mearsheimer, who's a political scientist at the University of Chicago, who has been really prophetic on this issue and a number of others, was recently on Useful Idiots with Katie Halper and Aaron Mate, and he gave a really interesting interview, and he said that he looked at the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin in a way that most of the mainstream media didn't, and really tried to hear what he was saying and get some sense of what his motivations were. Obviously, the Western press has been reporting the idea that Putin has a desire to conquer all of Europe, that there's a kind of a westward march that knows no end. And he made a very different kind of argument, saying that both kind of based on what he's saying and also strategically, there's very little evidence of that. Partly because the level of resistance that you get from occupying a country where there are Russian speakers, people who are sympathetic to you and your national identity, versus trying to take a city like Kyiv and holding a city like Kyiv where there's going to be sustained active resistance for a number of reasons, are two very different projects. And as much as Ukraine is struggling to resist Russia, Russia also knows that it has its own limits, and there's a trade-off in how much it wants to invest in pursuing and continuing this continued conflict. So all of that is to say, I think that we are being really underserved. The public as a whole is being underserved by a media that is not interrogating some of the prevailing narratives. And I think Nancy Mace is absolutely right to say, at very least, if you want America to keep funding this war effort, you have to define the terms or what the goals are in our involvement. And it can't just be bleeding Putin dry for the rest of all time without an end, when there's the consequence of Ukrainian lives being ended as a consequence, and also American tax dollars that I would argue could be spent more efficiently and effectively elsewhere.
And where no one believes, no military experts continue to believe it's possible for a total Ukrainian victory that involves taking back the country. Yeah. So that has to be part of the calculation, and we're not seeing truth-telling from our own administration on that point yet.
That's the realist perspective from folks like Mearsheimer, for sure.
More Rising right after this.